Good evening, everyone. We are a couple of seconds late tonight, and that's because behind the scenes, myself, Christopher, and Andy were already jumping into the conversation. So tonight is going to be a great chat. There's a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. The overall topic tonight is about whiskey writing and awards, and we were already talking about awards, so it just shows how important a topic of conversation it is, that it's on our minds already. Whiskey writing covers a wide range of people. You know, you've got bloggers, journalists, authors, loads of people under the whiskey writing category. And tonight I'm going to be joined by Andy Flatt, better known to many of you as the Amateur Drammer. And I'm going to be joined by Christopher Coates, who is the managing editor of Whisky Magazine. So we're going to be talking about how they got into whiskey writing, how they got into whiskey, and a little bit about the current whiskey writing side of things. And then we're going to be talking quite a lot about awards. Both of these guys are involved in the World Whisky Awards. And I know many of you will have questions about that. So as always, please send any questions that you have. Let us know what you're drinking tonight. It's Tuesday night. I hope you've had a good start to the week. And please welcome the guys in. Good evening, gents.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good to see you guys.
How's it going? I was going to... Andy from Aaron always rings in my head when I ask people, how are you getting on tonight? Because I was on a live stream with him and he said, this is that moment of the chat where we pretend that we've not been speaking to each other for 10 minutes before we go live.
Exactly.
And every time I ask people how they're getting on, that rings in my head. But how are you guys? How have you been?
Fantastic. I mean, it's. I think everybody's had a rather interesting year so far. Mine has been certainly been interesting. I was just telling you a second ago that I've done far more DIY this year than I thought I was going to do already. So that's good. That's a new skill developed for 2020. So I can't complain.
Yeah, I do wonder when I look at like the bookshelf that you've built behind you there, how many joiners are going to go out of business when we go back to normal because everyone's picked up, or I think thinks that they're very good at a new skill, but actually in a couple of months' time realize they're probably going to spend money getting it fixed. And not to say that the shelves aren't looking great, they look fantastic.
Well, there's a lot of weight on them, so if this all comes crashing down behind me midstream, you'll know who to blame.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Andy, what about you? How's your lockdown been?
It's not been too bad. I mean, I've still been continuing with the day job throughout, so I've not really had a break as such. But it's been nice to have that normality in amongst. But it's also nice now to be coming out the other side of lockdown, seeing a wee bit of light at the end of the tunnel too. So yeah, I think generally everybody's mood's kind of lifting, and it's slowly getting back to normal.
Definitely. I think I didn't realize, or I didn't think that it had affected me so much. But I guess it was gradual for 4 months, and then I went for a couple of drinks with some friends at the weekend there, and it was just a game changer. I came out of the pub after only an hour and a half, feeling so good about things getting back to normality, seeing a few more people down the street. There's always that thing when you get halfway to the shop and then have to turn back because you've forgotten your face mask. Yeah. I think we'll get there slowly but surely, right?
Yeah, it's going to become the new keys, glasses, wallet, watch.
Yeah,
mask.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm going to have to get a mask made that's got like a little passport holder or something in it. I think that would be the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
mask.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's get into it because we were already talking, and Chris, I had to cut you off halfway through what you were telling me, and it was all very interesting. So I'm very keen to get into the bones of the evening. But first of all, what have you got in your glasses tonight? I'm seeing a couple of well-charged glasses. So what are you drinking tonight?
Go ahead, Andy.
Well, I thought I'd stay somewhat on brand. So I've got a Tomatin Legacy.
Ah, good man. Lovely.
Good man.
I have made it into highball just for a bit more refreshment.
Ah, there you go.
That's the way to do it. Legacy, it's versatile is probably the one word that I would use for it, is a beautiful highball drink. Well, I personally drink a lot of it with ginger ale, and rather worryingly, my wife has taken the taste to it in whiskey sours. So the staff purchasing is going through the roof at the moment. But yeah, well enjoyed.
Yeah, I remember very well when Legacy launched, because I think that had been the time that I was still working at the Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh, and
Right.
I remember very well when that launched, and that was one of the first non-age statement products that I saw coming in there that got real attention very, very quickly, for how versatile it was, and a great price point as well. So certainly a good brand to be jumping in with on the highball there, Andy. I'm jealous.
I am as well. I've got my little Glencairn glass, and now all I want is a highball. I'm very, very jealous, but
that's what happens, though, isn't it? See, you're all on the neat whiskey, and then somebody gets the highball, and then suddenly you all feel parched.
Yeah, you're going raking through
the comments. There'll be someone calling me a heretic for putting soda in a whiskey any minute now.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be there somewhere. But hey, you drink it the way you enjoy it. But no, to your point there, where a couple of months back now, we were redoing tasting notes. Myself and one of my colleagues, Scott Fraser, and we very often do the tastings and the masterclasses and things. And it's very easy when you're doing that to kind of run through the motions. You're still trying to manage a room and think about what you're going to talk about next. So the tasting notes fly out your mouth without actually really assessing what you're drinking. So we occasionally go back to them and we'll spend a morning nosing and tasting these drams. And Legacy knocked us away. It was just couldn't get over how complex it was. And I think it touches on your point there, Christopher. It's a non-age statement, less than £30, but it's got that little bit of virgin oak in it. It's got that little bit more complexity. It's 43%. It starts to offer a few things, and I'm a really, really big fan of it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those whiskies that I remember talking to people at the time about the fact that if you want to talk about the marriage of distillery character and wood, it's without sort of veering too far. Obviously, it can, if it's something's too young or has too little maturation character, it can start veering into sort of immature notes. But this is that perfect balance between maturity and distillery character at a young age, and I certainly liked it for that at the time. Yeah,
big time. What about you? What's in your glass?
Well, from one heretic drinking a highball to another, I'm drinking a blend. So I'm definitely gonna have to be kicked out, because that's the favourite thing that people love to say to you when you find out that you work with whiskey. It's, oh God, you don't drink blends, do you? But although it's not a very usual blend, it's not a luxury whiskey. That's what I've got here from Compass Box at the moment. So. We moved house a little while ago, and it was lurking in a box, and until very recently when I started unpacking. So that was a nice find.
That is a great find. That is one of those things that, as people involved in whiskey, you stumble into a room or you unpack a box and you find something that you'd totally forgotten about, and that is just a wonderful moment as well. But that actually touches on something, Andy, that you were talking about. You asked a question, I believe it was on Facebook the other day there, what is your go-to blend? What blend do you drink? And I think it's a conversation that's been had a bit more recently. I know that Roy over at Aquavita did a session about blends, and talking about how good they can be. But about a week or so ago, I went for a walk with some mates, and of course had my hip flask with me and had a blend in it that was produced by the guys at Arran Distillery, and gave them it all and said, "Oh, here you go, nice little blend." And the feedback was, that's quite smooth for a blend. And it's a surprising thing, because originally the whole point of blends was to be smooth, and I don't know where that's maybe got lost over the years, or has it been lost in perception. But there's definitely a lot to be said for blends. And 9 times out of 10, when I'm in a local bar or just a pint pub, it's a blend that I'll drink 9 times out of 10.
Definitely. Well, I mean, the antiquary that your company produces is one of the. I mean, that's definitely one of the blends that got me into drinking got me into drinking blends.
Yeah.
It's certainly the blend that a lot of the I live in Leith, and a lot of the old boys around here drink
Right.
Antiquary
Still have
with their little half a heavy as well.
Yeah, cracking stuff. Yeah, fantastic. Now, we've got, like I say, we've got a lot to talk to tonight. We're talking about blends, we're talking about highballs, we're talking about various different things of whiskey. I've got a Glencairn with Tomatin 12 in it tonight. How did you get into whiskey? Because we're all involved in various levels now, and it's such a big part of both of your lives. How did you first get into it? Was there a whiskey that made you want to investigate it a little bit more, or was it something else?
Well, I grew up in a household that drank famous grouse and coke, so there was always around the house. I also grew up very short distance from Glenturret Distillery, so I went there quite a few times as a child. When people would come and visit, and we'd take them there as one of the sort of local tourist attractions. So I have a lot of very fond memories of sticking my head over the edge of washbacks and getting a big whiff of of the various aromas you get around a distillery, and the feeling of being in next to the mash tun and things like that. So that they were definitely very strong childhood memories for me. But I didn't really drink whiskey until I went to university, and then naturally it was a German that got me into drinking Scotch whiskey, because he was astonished that I had grown up in Scotland and didn't drink Scotch whiskey, and I was a rum drinker at the time. So
right.
So I got a terrible lecture from him, and he dragged me along to a few whiskey club sessions in Edinburgh.
That is fascinating. There's so many people. I never really appreciated how often that happened, but there's so many people that I've spoken to over the last few months throughout these sessions that have told me that they were introduced to whiskey by someone from out with Scotland, even though they grew up next to a distillery. And it maybe wasn't the case where you were, where a German took you to tastings and things like that. But Roy himself was saying that it was his Italian colleague who asked, "Why don't you know about whiskey? This is something you should know about." I think it's very often easy to overlook what's on your doorstep, and then when you start finding out about people from other cultures and around the world, that's when you start to really appreciate what you do have on your front door. So that's shockingly common how often I've heard that story now, but it's always a fascinating one to me. Andy, what about you?
First of all, I wish I had a great whiskey origin story like Chris with the childhood memories and stuff, but mine's a bit more simple than that. My father was always into whiskey, and I always remember he had a cabinet with like various. It was always single malts, and I'd never got into whiskey for the longest time. And he would try me with the occasional one here and there, and as time went on, I'd maybe come home from uni, and he'd be like, "Right, try this one, see what you think." And much to his, as hard as he tried, he couldn't find one that I liked. And it wasn't. This is a bit of a sad story, but it's got a happy ending, so bear with. It wasn't until it was my father had passed away several years ago with cancer, and when we were in the hospital, someone had smuggled in a bottle of whiskey. And as time went on, we thought, well, we'll just share a wee dram, because this might be we can last one sort of thing. And I was prepared just to drink the whiskey, whatever it was. That wasn't part of the discussion. But as I drank it, I actually found myself enjoying it. And I don't know if it was the moment or whatever it was, but there was just that wee spark lit up. And I think my father at that point, he could see that I'd enjoyed it. And we had that little moment where he's kind of gone, "I found one you liked," And then so, we kept the bottle, and it's become, I still have some of that bottle left, sort of stashed away. But that was my kind of introduction to whiskey. And from then it just sort of snowballed. I've got this kind of personality that if I maybe watch a TV program or a documentary, afterwards, if the guy's written a book about it, I'll probably buy that book because I want to know more, get inside it, yeah. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, I was at, it was the Whisky Stramash in Edinburgh with my brother, and he was good friends with a couple of guys who used to write for Edinburgh Whisky Blog back in the day.
Right.
And so I got introduced to them. They said, "Well, you should start a blog. If you're into whiskey, start a blog. We've had a great time doing it." And like many ideas you have when you're drunk, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And then fast forward 7 years, and here we are.
So let's continue on that then, because my next question was, how did your introduction to whiskey eventually lead to whiskey writing? So continue on with that, Andy.
So it was when I was thinking, I had this idea, but I had no idea how to actually do it. So I'd had a look at other whiskey blogs, and I'd always liked things like the Whiskey Sponge. Not so much for the sense of humour, which is great, but it was more for the anonymity. You could write what you wanted. The internet's anonymous, So I kind of went with this thing of, well, it could just be what I think, and I don't need to tell anybody who I am. And it's not, I'm just kind of writing because I want to have this record, not because I really want people to read it, And so I just sort of stumbled from there with a kind of, the Amateur Drammer pen name. Because also, if I'm just writing about whiskey and I don't know about it, I need to kind of keep that kind of amateur status, if you know what I mean. There's no point me having a whiskey blog knowing little about whiskey at the time and, sort of pontificating about Port Ellens and all these sort of old closed distilleries, because it just didn't seem right. So it was more about my whiskey journey, and it always has been that. And to be fair, over the last 6 or 7 years, the whiskey journey's taken me to where I am now, and I love what I do in whiskey. I mean, I wouldn't say I really work in the industry, but in this kind of bubble next to the industry, I work congregant to it almost. Yeah.
Industry adjacent.
Yes, that's it. Industry adjacent, definitely.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I know that's fascinating, because I think it kind of rings true to like the Scotch test dummies as well. When they started out on YouTube, it was a couple of guys that knew very little about Scotch whiskey, except from the fact that they liked it and wanted to record their tasting notes. So you now get to this point where you've got a cabinet like that behind you with some incredible whiskies in it, and even better, a can of Tennent's there. I mean, the obligatory big juicy on the shoulder.
It was when I was setting up earlier, and I was playing around with the lights and trying to get the angles right and so on. And I thought, I just need something in the background that keeps me in that kind of little kind of irrelevant and irreverent way that I like to be. And I thought, I need to hide something in the lineup, So I thought, you know what?
I like it. Juicy
tea right there.
Right below a Distiller's Edition Lagavulin as well, which is perfect positioning.
Good pairing. I'd have that pairing.
Yeah, I think that would be very, very good. Christopher, how about you? How did your love of whiskey become? I mean, it's your full-time job, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has been for 7 years now, and like sort of I've heard this from many people in the industry, where you sort of say, oh, how long have you worked in the industry? And they go, oh, I don't know, 30 years or 40 years. And you say, how did you get into it? And they say, oh, it was by accident, really. And that's exactly what happened to me. I graduated and had but wasn't quite sure where I was going to go or what I was going to do. I'd studied international politics and Spanish, and I thought that was very much the route I was originally going down. And then just by chance, I applied for a job at the Scotch Whisky Experience, on the basis of the fact that I'd by this point been to a number of tastings and enjoyed them, and had started buying a few bottles to enjoy at home. And I was only there for a few months, because during that time I started quite literally Googling jobs whiskey, and by pure fluke there happened to be a job based in Scotland with Whisky Magazine. But this was at a very, very low level in the company, and I've spent the last 7 years learning about whiskey, living it every day, and slowly but surely working my way up and learning something every day as well, because that's what I regularly tell people. If the more you know about whiskey, the less you know about whiskey. And as soon as you accept that, you'll know that there's no such thing as an expert, apart from maybe the guys that have been doing it for 40 odd years at a distillery every single day.
Yeah, but then even then, I think that if they were to take a tour at a distillery along the road, they would have questions to ask, right? Kind of goes back to what Andy was saying about becoming obsessive about a subject. That, and I've said it myself, I consider myself firmly to be a whiskey geek. I would say my job is to know more about Tomatin Distillery than anyone that I speak to. Mm-hmm. But when it goes to any other distillery, I'm just a fan who's excited to go and learn a little bit more. So like you say, the more you know, the less you know. Just seen a question pop up from Sean Murphy there, and it's an interesting one. And it's How do you, as part of a brand, approach an unfavourable review by a whiskey writer or one of your whiskies? And we can talk about reviews as well, because that's part of what both of you do. But I think my response to that, Sean, has changed over time. I think when I first started working in the industry, and was probably a bit more naive, I think I was very quick to say, well, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, that's rubbish. But then over time, you start to learn that you can't win them all. Whiskey is the beautiful spirit that it is because we don't all like the same one. And if we did, there would be one bottle behind all of us. It would be the same bottle. And if statistics are anything to go by, it would probably be Johnny Walker Red Label, right? Whiskey is so beautiful because everyone has an opinion on it and it's something different. Interestingly, now that I'm getting involved in actually whiskey making and involved with blending and things, I look at negative reviews probably almost more. I look for them more than I do for positive ones, because we're only going to release a whiskey that we believe is of a good quality and a high standard. It goes through a tasting panel. It goes through many lips before it gets into a bottle and onto a shelf. So we're confident that it's a good quality liquid. So when I do see a negative review, it's kind of good to see that and see, what can we learn from that? Where can we pick up from? Where can we go? Or is it just somebody who wants to have a wider gripe about the industry and focuses on a certain product that does that? And I think there's a little bit of that going on as well. But yeah, nowadays, I think I've gone to the, everyone has the right to their own opinion. I might not agree with it, but I also don't like certain whiskies. So what's your take on that, guys? When it comes to negative reviews as well as positive reviews, there has to be both, right? Because positive reviews don't mean anything without negative ones.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between slating something because you don't like it and giving constructive feedback on something that isn't, you're not, whiskey is on there is a scale of quality that you have to appreciate because there are a scale of price points. In terms of the specifically regarding how opinion factors into it, at Whisky Magazine, we always have 2 tasters. And we deliberately seek people out who have slightly different palates from one another, which does reflect in the scores that we deliver. So we hope that readers who are picking up our magazine 8 times a year or checking reviews online on the website can, over time, by getting to know our contributors, start to maybe get a little bit of an idea about the kinds of things that our reviewers prefer. But generally, because we don't do everything blind, they're only given region, style, and ABV, and in a blank sample bottle. We try to give them as little information as possible, including price. And I know that's a contentious one, because some people say, oh, well, you need the price to contextualize the whiskey that you're drinking. But for us, it's like, well, no, because you apply the price information afterwards, because if a whiskey's been rated as a 7.5, but it's £30 a bottle, well, that's a solid dram for £30 a bottle. But if it's been given a 7.5 and it's £10,000 a bottle, then you might want to start asking some questions. In terms of actually negative ones, that's not something that we come across too often. We obviously, occasionally you'll get a dud sample sent in, and we have processes in place there to make sure that we can refer back to liquid kept in archive. So if we review something and it gets a score that indicates maybe a fault with the liquid, we can reissue samples back to the original tasters from the original sample, to find out, to try and get rid of any errors there. If we do that again and we find that it's still coming out at what we'd call a fault score, usually we then go back to the producer and say, is this the liquid? Is this really the liquid, or has a dud sample come to us? And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and that's what makes life interesting. But I think if we've learned anything over, and certainly this is knowledge inherited rather than all through my own experience, but we've been going for 21 years now, and we find that the industry is actually very well receives negative feedback or constructive feedback very, very well, because quite often that is just as useful to them, or it seems to be just as useful to the industry as a positive one. If a particular parcel of stock has been rushed through to sale, and maybe because one half of the company wants it to go out there, and maybe the other half of the company didn't want it to go out there, but maybe one side won, that's useful food feedback for them, and hopefully also useful feedback for consumers when it comes to making their decision about whether it's worth parting with money for that particular product.
Yeah, that's great, because I think, well, first of all, if I was ever to receive an email saying, "Is this really the sample?" I think that would be crushing. If that came in, that's worse than any negative review you could get, because maybe it's not the sample, but if it was, that's bad.
But equally, sometimes so we do get things in sometimes, and there's the seal's not been right on the bottle, and perhaps it's oxidized, or if there's been a lot of headspace in the bottle, and if it's come from the other side of the world, and there's been a lot of temperature fluctuations, so things can happen to samples in transit, as we all know. I mean, sometimes, gosh, there's been times that I've opened a bottle, poured a dram, left it on the side, wandered off to do something, come back, and something's gone a bit wrong with it, but the rest of the bottle's been fine. Strange, mysterious things happened with whiskey occasionally, and we have to be able to account for that before damning anyone in the press.
Well, I think another great thing about the whiskey industry, and we always talk about this, is the people at all levels, and luckily I work for a company that very rarely gets bad reviews, which is a fantastic thing to have, and it gives you confidence as a brand ambassador to go and talk about your product. But even when you get to the position where someone reviewing the product doesn't enjoy it, 9 times out of 10, the review reflects that and says, this was not for me, but if you like X, Y, and Z, you might enjoy this. I think all people that are reviewing realize that they do have an influence on buying habits, and along with that goes a responsibility to kind of state the fact that just because I don't like it doesn't mean that you won't like it. And other things like that. Andy, what's your take on that? You do a big part of what you do at Amateur Drammer is tasting notes and reviews. So,
yeah, I think that's the thing. Back in the day, the Times food critic A.A. Gill, he once said that it's not that I enjoy writing bad reviews; it's just that everybody enjoys reading them. So I think there comes this thing where people like to give bad reviews to get that kind of momentum. But there's also, on the other side of it, there's as many people love to give good reviews of everything.
Yeah.
And I think it's about striking that balance. You don't want to be in the "this is terrible" to "this is brilliant" camp. You want to just, as you disassociate yourself from what your opinion means to the quality of the whiskey. So again, I'd be humbled if someone bought the bottle because of my recommendation. I would always say, try it first. And I think if you look at a lot of, I don't know, you don't see a lot of bad reviews, but I think what people don't like, if there's a concept they don't like when NAS first started coming out, no age statements and so on, the first NAS whiskey they reviewed, it would be a concept bashing rather than a liquid bashing.
Yep.
Once it's been around for a while, it's slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
If you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. That's very common as well. I've seen quite a few reviews online where, rather than actually assessing the whiskey on the merits of the liquid in the bottle, it turns into a lecture about this is overpriced. And while I appreciate that some of us are very privileged to be able to drink these whiskies as part of our job every day, and people have wildly different salaries, or within the UK and around the world, not every whiskey is, the reason there are whiskies at different price points is because there are people that have different spending power and people that want to invest different amounts of their income in whiskey. And just because you have chosen that, you have arbitrarily decided, unilaterally, that this particular whiskey isn't worth £65 or £85, well, that doesn't really have any bearing necessarily on the actual quality of the liquid. It's a useful comment to have afterwards, but if it ends up being the whole substance of the review, one suspects that it's more, as Andy says, a little bit about clickbait moaning, which we all know is a thing.
Yeah, there definitely seems to have been a trend of that I've seen recently, and it's exactly what Andy was saying. You get a little bit of traction from a negative, you guys as commentators on the industry have again a responsibility to hold the industry to account, hold the industry to standards, in the same way that wider journalists have that role when it comes to politics or various other things. That you have that role to play. I think the problem becomes when those numbers start tickling up on that single post it becomes very, very attractive to do that again. And Andy, I know yourself, you've put a while back, you put a message out about the language that was used in press releases, and it was really nice to see that, because I think a lot of us feel the same way. What was also very nice to see was that the next post that you put out was not another shouting match at the industry. You know, you had an issue, you voiced that issue, but then you moved on and you didn't go back to just seeking that traction all the time.
Yeah, and it's still kind of about the liquid, because I wouldn't, if I got a poorly constructed press release full of word soup, I wouldn't then give a negative review to the whiskey because I didn't like the press release. So it's important to kind of think about the things as two separate entities, you know, and that was kind of my point there. But to go back to what Chris touched on earlier, I think when you talk about the cost of a whiskey, cost and value are two entirely different concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly,
there was a £500 bottle of whiskey that I thought that I didn't like, but someone bought it and it gave them an immense amount of pleasure to drink it, then that gives them value. The cost is inconsequential in that kind of framework, if you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah, and that's what becomes difficult, because, as you were saying, Chris, you know, a 7.5 on a £30 whiskey for someone is going to be, oh, that's a solid dram. But if it's somebody who's currently buying the bottles that are on offer in your Tesco's, Morrison's at £22, £25 all the time, and then they see that £30 bottle that they were looking at has only got a 7.5, you know, that's when the cost and value does become, you know, there's no set guide on that. So I think that's where assessing the liquid for the quality of the liquid in and of itself first is very important to do.
Exactly.
Now, moving on from that, we're all in the industry and we get some pretty incredible experiences, but writers and journalists in the whiskey industry get invited to some pretty cool events or things to do with various companies. What's your highlights been? What's your favourite, I guess you could call them press trips, been to date?
I'll let you fire on, Andy.
Okay, I went to a tasting. It was last year at the Highland Whisky Festival, and it was a Brora vertical, and it was 5 expressions of Brora from concurrent years, but it was situated in the Brora filling store.
Oh, wow.
And it was just the coolest thing. You know, you're sitting there drinking whiskey that's been matured in casks that were filled several feet.
Yeah.
You know? Second to that comes several cigar smoking moments and sharing some sherries with Chris on the press trips we've been on as well. But the Brora just tips it, I think.
Just tips it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
That's an interesting thing as well. When I was doing my little bit of research behind this, amazing how many people that are involved in whiskey love sherry. I think all three of us are big sherry fans tonight, and we'll talk about it till we're blue in the face, that how much whiskey drinkers should go and try a glass of sherry. But yeah, Chris, what about you? What's been some of your moments?
I mean, the very first press trip I ever went on was to Glengarry Distillery in Aberdeenshire, and that was when Rachel Barry was still master blender there, and that definitely sticks in my mind, just because it was that first experience of going on a press trip as a newly minted whiskey journalist. So that'll always have a very special place in my heart. I think in terms of the one that probably most influenced the rest of my career would be the first time that I was invited on a press trip to experience a preview of the Spirit of Speyside Whisky Festival, and that always stayed with me, because it was beyond a brand experience. It wasn't a trip to just go and visit one distillery and learn about one set of people. It was very much learning about a whole part of Scotland, its history, the community that lives there, visiting the Highlander Inn, going with the Glenlivet Hill trek up on the Arga Cats up the hill, going down to Craig Ellicky Bridge and having a dram by the Spey, these kinds of experiences that once you've lived them, they stay with you forever. And that's obviously why that particular festival continues to bring back people every year, including all the very disappointed people that were unable to go this year, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's been a lot of that this year, sadly, but yeah, not cancelled, just postponed, I think, is the best way to look at all these things.
Exactly.
These distilleries, many of them have been around for 150, 200 years. They're still going to be there. I think what we're finding difficult at the moment is trying to get a 123-year-old building to conform to social distancing when it comes to tours, but we're getting there. So there'll be more on that to look out for in the next couple of days and weeks, folks, in terms of when we're reopening. But I know the industry as a whole is trying to get back to a sense of normality. Now, I'm going to go on because, Chris, I was speaking to Becky Paskin a couple of months ago, more generally about our whiskey and what they're doing there. But I talked to Becky a little bit about her background as a whiskey journalist, and the impression that I got from her was that she was a little bit concerned as to the way that whiskey journalism was going and the current state of things. And actually, Graham Fraser's asked a question that kind of ties into that, and that was, do you think that digital whiskey reviews and information will kill off written publications? And you very much work with written physical publications. What's your take on the current state of whiskey journalism and the written digital thing?
So the written digital thing is a fantastic, it's a fantastic topic, and I'm very pleased to say that print is dead. Long live print. The industry is going through a period of massive change. So publications that produced content that was easily shifted over to a digital platform. So I'm talking particularly quite general lifestyle content. Quite often stuff that was more pictures, less words, particularly stuff that was quite short form. So I'm talking maybe max 700 words an article, maybe up to maybe just about up to 1,000. That kind of content, which quite a lot of printed magazines were. They're seeing their circulation figures fall through the floor because that kind of content has moved over to websites, to social media. Instagram is if you want to look at beautiful pictures, you go on Instagram. If you want to read short articles, there's plenty of websites for that. And certainly, but at the same time, we've also seen niche independent magazines about very particular topics. Their circulations are actually increasing at the moment. So if you look at figures published by the PPA, you'll see that actually there's something of a renaissance in print going on right now, and we're very lucky to be caught up in that. So for me, the value of printed media is intrinsically linked to a couple of things. One, people like something physical. We stare at screens all day, no more so than during lockdown when we're all on a million Zoom calls a day on top of the normal staring at a screen that we do. So I think there's definitely value in stepping back from that and having something on your hands and sort of de-digitizing for a bit. And we certainly see that in sales figures across the whole of the independent print industry. Particularly on terms of the type of content, though, there's quite a lot of research that's been done into the kinds of content that people engage with online, and generally the attention span of your reader on a mobile device or on a laptop or a desktop tends to trail off once you start approaching. Once you get past 1,000 words, you might keep them to 1,500, and then people really get bored of scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and that tends to be why things like long reads are hidden away in lower down sections or specific sections of websites, because they're much harder for people to consume. And that's certainly where printed media comes into its own, because if you're going to really dissect a topic over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 words, that's where printed media comes in. People can pick it up, they can put it down, they can go back, they can reread things, they can sit, they can take it at their own pace and enjoy it in the same way that they would a book. And certainly that's luckily seems to be backed up by behavior of readers. So
do you think has there been any element of social media, of digital media, kind of conditioning people towards reading smaller articles? Has there been an element in which people just generally don't read long articles like they once did, or is there, like you're saying, a real crying out for something physical where you can sit down, you can switch off the screen and spend a bit of time with it?
I think you need to know your audience, obviously, so, and we aim to provide something, across our website and then across the magazine. We aim to provide a little bit of a bit of both. If somebody's a light, coming in, dipping in for a light read, they're never going to jump into your 3,000 word piece on, why particular types of wine casks, shouldn't be used or something like that. But you have, particularly with a topic like whiskey, you have people who already have that level of knowledge. If somebody's been drinking whiskey for a long enough time, or has been engaging with it deeply enough, that they've got that level of knowledge that makes that sort of couple of 100-word article kind of irrelevant, because they're just reading what they already know. That's when people seek out well-researched long-form content, and that's certainly what we aim to provide at Whisky Magazine.
Yeah, I think your recent article about the history of Dalmore is a great example of that. That was a fascinating article about a distillery that is just along the road from me. It's a 5-minute walk. I actually worked at the company for a year, and I learned more about the history of that distillery reading that one article, because I wasn't having to piece together various posts from across the internet. I could sit down and actually digest the whole history of it. So that was a great example of that. So
thank you.
Thank you for writing it, and really, really well researched. I think you were telling me as well that there was a couple of bits and pieces in there that the brand themselves maybe necessarily didn't know before. So
and that's the hallmark of when you know that you have a well-researched piece. If you have the brand coming back and saying, "Where did you find this? Can you show us your source?" That's it. Yeah. It's kind of the opposite of the tasting one. It's a good thing. It means you can go, well, actually, we found it in X archive, or you can find it here. If you refer to wherever, and that's what we aim to do, and that's the kind of research that's where, for me, that's where paid journalism comes in. That's why that content is worth paying for. That's why these journalists that are working for these kinds of titles, that is their day job. Their day job is to have the time to be able to dedicate into having every whiskey book on their shelf, going to archives, finding out that information that you can't just get from a cursory Google search.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, Justine Hazelhurst has asked if the digital version of Whisky Magazine differs to the printed version. She's only ever subscribed to the printed version.
So no, so we have there's sort of 3 ways that you can read us. So we have the printed version. We have what we call our digital edition, which is run through an app. So that's iOS and Android app. But that is just a straight lift of PDFs from that would have been sent to the printer to produce the magazine. So there's no, in terms of the actual content itself, there's no change. Occasionally we'll include like digitally only supplementary information. So for instance, if there's been a distillery focus about Tomatin, we might compile every tasting we've ever done on that brand and include it at the end, because obviously you can add as many pages as you like to a digital publication. So we'll sometimes add in supplementary information, videos if we have them, but the actual features themselves, written features, they don't change.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting thing as well, because you're paying journalists, researching journalists to research for articles for a magazine, but obviously there is a lot of people still digesting that form of media on an iPad rather than getting a magazine delivered to the door. So it makes sense still to have it on a digital form if possible. I personally love holding a magazine. Like you say, switching off a backlight is nice for a while, so holding a magazine is great. So, and Andy, I think there's been as much change in the blogging world as there has in the kind of the writing world as well. We talked very briefly before we came on. When I started working in whiskey back in 2012, it seemed like blogging was probably the main outlet for impassioned enthusiasts to communicate what they were drinking and how they felt about it. But now we live in a world where we've got YouTube. You've got a lot of great personalities on YouTube doing a lot of great stuff that would have otherwise probably have gone into blogs a few years back. You've also got Instagram. I talked to the guys from Barrel to Bottle a couple of weeks ago, and they're communicating their love of whiskey through photography. How do you feel the whole, the blogging world has changed even over the last 10 years?
I think the passion's always the same. and the spark to start something is the same. It's how you go about it that's maybe different, you know? So back when I first started, it was all about, a website and just writing notes, mostly for myself, that I just put out there. But now there's so many more available options. So you might have that passion, but just do some nice photographs on Instagram. And you're still fulfilling that same need, driving that same passion. You're just doing it in a different way. So the why is still there, but the how is different. If you see where I'm going with that. It's like there's many different vehicles you can do it with now. I think when I first started kind of blogging, then there wasn't really many whiskey YouTube channels, and there wasn't much on Instagram, But now there's more tools in the toolbox, I think, is maybe the best way to put it.
If you started today and you wanted to communicate your love of whiskey, is blogging the way you would go? Is that still what you would do?
I think, yes. I think it would be, because that's just my kind of style. I like to just sort of ramble away, and I don't think that would come across visually. I think I just like to sit and write, and it's like that thing where, I don't know if you've seen the internet meme, and it's a picture of Morgan Freeman, and at the bottom it just says, "You are reading this in Morgan Freeman's voice."
Yeah.
I've always had this want that when someone's reading what I write, they're hearing me talking about the whiskey almost to them in my voice, using my language, using my words, and that's how I want to come across.
Yeah.
I don't know if it does that, but that's how I've always pictured it in my head anyway,
Yeah, well, certainly with what you do, it is all about, like you say, it's the passion, and that comes across in leaps and bounds. But also, people living locally will know that you've got the Amateur Drammer Whisky Club. You do tastings regularly, slightly less so this year because of various reasons.
Less so, yeah.
Yeah, but I've even got a bottle behind me for an upcoming tasting that you were planning earlier in the year. So it's still probably the only closed bottle on that shelf behind me, but we'll be getting that. But I think what I'm trying to get at there is that even though it's based around the blog, that's led you to be able to communicate about whiskey in so many different ways. So you contribute to local press, you're also doing the club. So the blog's the core, but it's grown into become so much more because of that. And because of the quality on there.
I think it's just grown arms and legs. And it got to the point where I was confident with my writing. So I thought, well, maybe I should see if I'm confident with my talking about whiskey. Because it's easy to write anything you want on the internet and it's fine. But then I thought, maybe I should just start doing tastings. Because I thought, I've been to a few now. Maybe I could do that. And I kind of hummed and hawed about it for a while and thought, maybe it's not my thing. Maybe I shouldn't. So on a whim, I bought 120 tasting glasses. And they arrived in 2 days. And I thought, now I've bought this and I've got this huge big box in the spare room, I am going to have to do something about it. And that was the step it took, just to, sometimes you just have to decide to do it and then figure out the hows and whys later on,
Yeah, particularly who's washing the dishes, I bet, is the tough one.
Yes, there was for a while. I was washing them all individually by hand afterwards. I have a nice new venue with a dishwasher, so it's fine. So you can tell a passionate man by his dishpan hands.
So both of you have come to whiskey in a different way. You've both taken slightly different steps around the writing side, but that's led you both to be involved in the World Whisky Awards. Tell me a little bit about that, Christopher. You're maybe best to talk about that because you're a category chair. Is that the right terminology?
So I chair the Scotch Whisky category judging panel for the World Whiskies Awards, and the World Whiskies Awards, for those that don't know, is an offshoot of Whisky Magazine. So as is Whisky Live, the global whiskey festival brand. So they all came originally from the core that is Whisky Magazine, and the World Whiskies Awards emerged very much because of this need to have more comparison across the whole global spectrum of whiskey. Reviews in the magazine, 8 times a year, that's fantastic, and you can compare within that one issue. But giving a global context on it at a sort of snapshot once a year was seen as being very important. So we're still carrying on with that. So we have awards in other categories too. We do them in beer, gin, vodka, various other categories, and they're all still going ahead, although remotely. Usually we'd like to do them in person, but we announce them each year in March. This year it was done done digitally. And I think what's really special for me about that particular awards program is that the number of different countries that are entering product is absolutely incredible, and it's growing every year. When speaking to my colleagues, when it started, it really was Scotland, Ireland, America, Japan. That was about it, and now even in the 7 years that I've been with the business, the number of different countries on that list is just shooting through the roof, and the entries that we're seeing into particular style categories as well, because we both break everything down by country, but also by style. And you're seeing categories like wheat whiskey, which isn't something that a few years ago there would have been globally there probably wouldn't have been enough to really enter necessarily just straight wheat whiskey into that. And that category is really growing. Rye from countries outside of the United States, that's another category that we're seeing that's growing, that's fantastic. And I certainly enjoy poring over those spreadsheets every year, which sounds a bit nerdy, but it's interesting.
So, Andy, you get the call from World Whisky Awards asking you to be a judge. What is the process of being a judge? What does how long does the competition last? What do you do on the day? From what Chris was saying there about all the categories, it sounds like a terrible job. So please tell us about how difficult your job as a judge is. Okay,
well, the first thing you do when you get a call to judge something like this is have a big attack of imposter syndrome. And you start thinking to yourself, am I qualified to judge such a competition? Then you think, well, I've been invited, so I'm going to turn up, And it's very much runs like I thought it would do. There's a nice venue and you're judging various categories and the category, but everything's done blind. I think that's really important to do things blindly, but also you kind of need to always make sure you're comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges. So you need to have enough categories to make everything a fair comparison, but you don't want to start having ludicrous categories out there as well, So it is very much, it sounds, oh, it must be a terrible job to go and try all those whiskies. But when you're on the spot and you have to maybe try 50 whiskies in a day and you have to come up with tasting notes on the spot and you've got time limited, yeah, in a way it is quite daunting, And there are people there who make it look easy, and maybe it is easy for them. But for me, when you're judging maybe 12 different entries in one reasonably narrow, and again, it's like scoring's not something I do. So I have to kind of get my head around the scoring system as well, So it was a real interesting experience and a kind of evolution in the way I sort of taste and perceive whiskey as well. So it was great to be a part of. And I think as well, it's really sort of helped me narrow down sort of certain flavour profiles and what I'm looking for. Because I've had to try and not make it personal.
Mm-hmm.
I can't judge it on, oh, I like that, I don't like that. It has to be sort of slightly broader than that. I can't mark down every peaty whiskey if I didn't like peaty whiskies, or mark down all virgin oak if I didn't like virgin oak, or if I had a problem with NAS whiskies, mark them all down. You have to make it quite sort of constructive and fit into another framework, which makes you think outside the box, which has been a great thing for me to develop the way I taste and approach whiskey.
Yeah. And have you been able to get hints and tips from the other judges that are on the panel with you?
I will admit to spending quite a bit of time trying to earwig Charlie McLean, who's on the next table.
Right.
But I think in the end, you just have to be you, go with your gut, and listen to what your own mind's telling you. I think the first question you always have to, you try a whiskey and go, right, do I like it? And if you like it, then you can take it from there, So I never score whiskies when I review them. So I've had to take a framework and then kind of make it fit my own sort of analytical process. So I always start everything at 5. If we're talking about out of 10, start at 5. And if I like the balance, it'll add a point. If I don't like the balance, I'll take off a point. And just add in all these little factors to try and find a score. So that was the big challenge for me, was trying to put a numerical value on a whiskey and what made one 0.25 better than another.
Right.
Exactly. And the idea is that by having judges work in small teams as well, rather than having everybody tasting everything, which leads to inevitable palate fatigue. And, that's one particular topic regarding awards that I'm very passionate about. I think that if you're going to ask people to taste, 60, 70, 80 whiskies in a session, that's nuts, because I think there's enough evidence to show that even when you have enough judges that you can start accounting for biases, or preferences, if you push people to the point where everybody's getting palate fatigue, you start getting scores for things that have big, bold, punchy flavor profiles, particularly stuff that's usually over 48% ABV or over. These are the ones that suddenly start getting marked up, and that's why we'd rather have more judges working in teams that are large enough, small enough that you're not giving everybody everything, but large enough that they can account for each other's biases, and give them less to taste on a day. And hopefully you can start. I mean, obviously you can't control all of these variables, but you try to control them as much as possible, so that the data that comes out of that is as empirical as something that's based on personal preference can be.
So how does the final number for a particular dram get landed on? Is it the average of that group? Is that
correct? Yeah,
that's the way you do it. Yeah.
So it's calculated using all of the scores from a group, and because tasting's done in different stages, but it's kind of like the Olympics. You get judged in your style in your country first, and then you get judged in your style against everything from the rest of the world. So we take you up and through, and in fact there's actually another layer to it as well, because we judge you in your style, in your country, in your age bracket, maturation time bracket as well. So non-age statements, non-aged single malts from France are all judged against each other first, and that means that you do end up with quite niche categories at first, but then that builds up. So by the time you get world's best single malt, that has worked its way through various categories, and it's not just a score that we've plucked out of the air from one judging panel.
Yeah. Now, you touched on it very briefly there, the giving awards to something that is deeply personal. And I spoke about this ahead of time. It's a question that I have because we're very lucky at Tomatin to get a great number of awards, and we touched on it as well, from various different bodies, which is another thing that we maybe need to talk about. But one thing I always go back to is that awards are great. They show they show an overall character that is there in that product, but ultimately it will come down to whether you like it or not. And I'll never forget the time where a customer at a show in the Netherlands came up to my table with a certain book in his hand. We'll not name names, but he opened the book and he saw the score of one of the whiskies on the table and said, "I want to try that one." And I gave him a dram, and he said, "This is meant to be a very nice whiskey. I don't enjoy it." And I was like, exactly. Throw that book in the bin right now. Like I say, I'm not naming names at all. But what's your view on that? Again, whiskey is such a personal preference thing. We were talking about it a little bit earlier on. Where is the value of awards? I personally see a great deal of value in awards, and I think we share a similar understanding of where that comes from. But as someone that's so deeply involved in them, give us your take on that.
I was saying to you earlier, the example I always give to people whenever I'm asked about awards is that, well, not all awards are born equal, as I've just talked about. The paper trail that I personally believe a rigorous award needs to have to reach its conclusions, and that's one set of criteria that I would say is very relevant. The spread of your judging panel as well. You want people from different parts of the industry, outside of the industry, different. Ideally, I think you need people with different levels of experience as well, and different tastes in there. You want a global panel as well, because palates vary globally. So these things are obviously behind the scenes that contribute to what makes a credible award. But in terms of their actual value, I always say to people, well, I know nothing or very little about wine. And when I'm standing in a supermarket aisle looking at 2 bottles of wine, and I maybe know which grape I want, or I maybe have an idea of what part of the world I want my bottle of wine to come from, and if they're both at the same kind of price, the reality is that I probably end up buying the one that's got the shiny medal on it. and I think there's a lot of consumer data out there that backs up that conclusion. They do have, whether we like to admit it or not, awards when displayed on packaging and when used in marketing, they have they do have an influence on buying habits. And that for me means that there is that moral obligation as an organization that runs awards to make sure that if somebody has a problem with your conclusions, that you can go, fine, here's the data, come and have a look, and obviously you can't do that for every person in the world that moans, but particularly if somebody came with a credible complaint, at least you've got that data to fall back on. And ultimately, I think in terms of that value as well, is I was very careful to stress that I am an amateur when it comes to wine. I enjoy wine, but I don't really know anything about it, and that's why they are useful to me. I see a lot of posts going up online every year around awards season where people who I know a great deal about whiskey are saying, I can't believe this whiskey won this award or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not meant to help you. You could walk into a bar with 800 whiskies, name every one and probably categorize them by what year they were released in, that you're not the audience for this kind of media. You don't need help. But the vast majority of people out of our lovely little whiskey bubble of people that, for whom this is their life, outside of that whiskey bubble, most people just have their normal life and happen to like whiskey. And whiskey is something that they buy alongside their wine and their fabric softener and their sausages. And they don't have, or want to invest that kind of time in learning about fermentation times and reflux to make that buying decision. So they rely on people who do dedicate their life to it to come to hopefully the right conclusions, or at least as right a conclusion as a human being can ever come to about anything.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. If anyone who is watching this video or listening to the podcast afterwards, you are in the 1% of whiskey drinkers in the world. And it's a fascinating percent to be in, because we get to see and try so many incredible whiskies. But a lot of these wider things that go on are not necessarily targeted for us. And I think it comes down to what you're saying there, is it's confidence that it's money well spent. And I totally agree. Now, another thing that we touched on was the quality of the award giver itself. If you're standing in the wine aisle in your supermarket and you've got your 2 bottles of wine in front of you, and one of them has a gold medal from one award and one of them has a gold medal from another award, how do you know which one to pick? Personally, I would always look for the most recent one, because it's probably the closest to when that was bottled. But how do you navigate the award presenters?
Do you want me to give you that? Do you want to answer that one, Andy?
I think, again, it goes back to this kind of who are awards for. And I think if we can just jump back a little bit to what Chris was saying, it was best explained to me when you talk about, the 1%, you talk about the 1, the 9 and the 90. Mm-hmm. You've got the 1% who are sort of single cask strength whiskey geeks. You've got the 9% who are educated and want to know more. Then you've got the 90% who are like, ooh, that one's got a gold medal. Yeah. And to the 90%, who's given the award really doesn't matter. They're kind of your supermarket buyers who are thinking, right, what's the oldest whiskey I can get for the least money? And this one's also got a medal. But when you know a little bit more and your knowledge increases, there are certain awards that you maybe think, right, okay, I will trust this one more. And I tend to judge that on the volume of press releases I get from certain awards. Some of them seem to award very, very many awards, which again, it's just like whistling into the wind. But with the amount of awards that come out, you have to, again, if a whiskey was winning consistently several awards, then I'd maybe pay attention. But I think if I'm judging a whiskey's quality and would I like to buy it, I tend to look more if someone whose palate I trust or another writer has recommended it, whose palate I think mine's maybe similar to, my tastes are similar to, that's where I look. But gold medals on the bottle, I think when you get to the other end of the kind of like geeky spectrum, I don't think they really matter quite so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the reality is this is where the burden lies on the brand, and this is obviously, I guess, where it comes down to the sort of the integrity of people who work at the at the brands to enter awards that they know are credible. There are not specifically speaking about the whiskey category, but or even the drinks category, but the wider awards industry is a thing. There are plenty of companies out there that will approach you, and you'll just get an email in your inbox that says, "Congratulations, you've won." You're Christopher. You're the I don't know, the today's Instagram whatever person who was born on a Wednesday, and you've won an award. Congratulations! If you want your trophy, pay £999. These companies exist, and they're out there, and we and I suppose this is part of our job as journalists, holding the industry itself to account, and that's where our sort of role with engaging with the trade itself comes in. But we have to hope that brands recognise that it's more damaging to them to have a million awards from these organizations that nobody's really ever heard of, or if you actually scratch a little deeper and you go on their website and you see that you just effectively buy a reward or something, it's up to them to differentiate those from organizations that spend tens of thousands of pounds every year, bringing judges in and having a very rigorous judging process. And broadly, I think we're very lucky in this category that most brands recognize that distinction.
So that's an interesting point, because I would agree to an extent. I would say most quality brands would be on board with that, but I do think there are, as in any category, we talked about, you mentioned washing up powder and all that. There are other brands which just aren't as good, maybe for various reasons, and they still want a gold medal, right? So maybe then they start answering that email that says pick up your medal for this amount of money. So I think there's a bit of both, and I think that's when, with a little bit of research, like you say, and you go back to the paper trail and really look into it, that's when us as consumers can get a much better understanding of what's that brand all about, and go from there. But on the surface of it, I don't think it's as clean cut as we would like it to be, and say, I mean, I know at Tomatin we sign up to, I think, 2 or 3 award ceremonies a year, and we do them because they are the quality award ceremonies that are well recognized, and it adds value to the brand when you get an award from those companies. So we do subscribe to that sort of model, but like I say, I think there is an element of, everyone wants a gold medal at some point. And I was doing a tasting the other day, and I was saying, if you look hard enough, you can find an award for any whiskey on the shelf. It is just about finding the ones that are quality and actually mean something.
And I think that's where you have, and this is something that we're certainly looking into at the moment, is starting to provide, awards, the burdens on awards companies to start providing more and more information about their process on the website. So we detail our process. It's right there. We don't hide anything about how to enter as well. That's all there. So a consumer, if they are so, if they're so inclined, can go. They can see how it works. They can see, how people enter their products. And we try to regularly update the criteria for each category as well, so that you don't want to have a category that's sort of single malt whiskies distilled in the morning and aged in bourbon barrels for exactly this amount of time. You can't have a million different categories like that, and that's why we try to have very clearly defined ones. And when we think there needs to be additional criteria added to a particular category, we add it. I'm actually in the middle at the moment, as we speak, updating category definitions for the World Whiskies Awards, and because every year something crops up and you think, that should be in there. You don't want any chance of something slipping through the net and ending up in the wrong category or entering when it maybe shouldn't.
Yeah. Now, I've got one final question, but before I get onto that, there was a question that came in from Justine, and it tied back to the way the World Whisky Awards do things. And it was, have you ever had an example of where you look at the scores on a certain product and half of the scores are incredibly low and the other half are incredibly high? And if so, in that situation, do you still go with nothing in the middle? And do you still go with the average, or do you have to look into that a little bit more and try and find out what's going on there?
So I don't directly work on the. So this is something I think it's important to point out. I don't directly work on the awards side of our business. So we have a very rigid separation of church and state between awards, commercial and editorial in our business. So we maybe sometimes don't talk to each other as much as we should do. but personally, I think I'd rather have it that way than the alternative. But certainly, what I know from past experience is if there is ever a sample that's been scored or for any reason called into question, it's reviewed. And the reason we keep archive liquid of everything that's been entered, it can be retasted. Obviously it's not ideal to have to resit a whole panel, but if we felt that that there was some reason that we needed to do that, then we'd either do the panel again remotely, probably via Zoom. We'd send out the whole flight again, and so it's compared amongst its peers once again, or take some other view. If it was something super serious and it needed to be withdrawn from the competition altogether, then that's what has to happen. For us, what's most important is that the data that we get out of it at the end is correct.
Brilliant. Now, like I say, I've got one final question, and it's for both of you, but Andy, I'll jump to you because it ties into what you were saying about, when award season comes around, you get lots of newsletters from the brands saying what they've won. But what I want to ask both of you as writers and journalists, how do you feel about the way Whisky Awards are handled by the wider media? Because certainly from what I see, they really only seem to be picked up if they showcase something out of the ordinary winning. So if I ever hear Scotch on the rocks again whenever a world whiskey wins an award, I think I don't know what I'll do, but it won't be pleasant. It seems that if Dave in the pub enjoys a Japanese whiskey, it's Scotch on the rocks. And then the other example is, and this is close to home for the World Whisky Awards, with Lidl winning Best Blended Scotch Whisky under 12 years old. And then that got sensationalized to Lidl wins Best Scotch Whisky. So, Andy, I'll come to you because you touched on getting all these newsletters. What do you feel about, the way the media handles awards?
I think it's only really, it goes back to the whole thing, dog bites man, that's not a news story. Man bites dog, however, there's something there. So going back to maybe say, for instance, in the past, maybe a Japanese whiskey won best whiskey in the world. Well, that's dog bites. That's man bites dog. Sorry, that's something entirely different. That's a headline. That's different. That's an outlier. So I think it tends to be these sort of things that tend to create headlines. If it's not quite clickbait, I wouldn't say that. But it tends to be if there's a big difference in what you'd expect. Whereas if a Scottish brand won best Scotch in the world, well, that's not really news because they should win that anyway. It goes back to what you're saying about Lidl's, and it's, supermarket blend or supermarket single malt, whatever. It shouldn't have won, so therefore it's a story.
Yeah.
So not quite a misrepresentation, but there's definitely a kind of skew towards if an outlier wins, it's news. Whereas if something you'd expect to win wins, well, where's the story there?
I think the Lidl case in particular is actually very interesting because they went through a period where the investment they were making in the liquid that was going into their bottles was quite incredible. They the quality was really very, very high, and particularly some of the aged blends they released as well were not the kind of thing I would have expected to find on the shelf in that particular shop, and yet clearly somebody in the business thought, look, if we're going to do this, let's do it right, and they went to partners in the industry, and they found the liquid, the best liquid they could get for the volume they wanted and the money they wanted, and that's not to say that they weren't deserving of those particular accolades. I think how the media handles it, to your point, is an interesting one. The broader media, while it's fun to have a bit of a moan, part of me is kind of just happy that the mainstream media is talking about whiskey in a positive way. I'm kind of like, well, to be honest, if this makes anybody buy another bottle of Scotch or Japanese whiskey or wherever the whiskey came from, then that's at the very least, that's maybe even just getting somebody into brown spirits that usually only drinks vodka or gin, or usually is a wine drinker or a beer drinker. If that, I think the other thing to bear in mind with that is that I'd be hard pressed to be convinced that kind of media reaction hasn't played a part in the ascendancy of Japanese whiskey generally in the mind of the public as well. not all that long ago, if you told people, oh, I really like Japanese whiskey, people would go, really? Oh gosh. And whereas now people go, oh, I've heard about Japanese whiskey, it's really good, isn't it? And that's a good thing, because while those particular headlines, about the fact that Scotch is on the rocks because the Japanese whiskey is won world's best whiskey, just because that headline was sensationalized and maybe it wasn't, the best journalism out there, it's not going to win a Pulitzer Prize or something, it nevertheless does have an influence. It is introducing people to this idea. It's starting to break down mental barriers, and whether that's a good thing for the Scotch industry or not, obviously, who knows? But it's certainly hopefully making more people drink whiskey, which I think is something we can all agree is a good thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great thing, and it's a perspective that I hadn't considered myself. So thank you for answering that, because when I was particularly on the Lidl one, I read the article that Becky wrote at the time, which actually raised a fascinating point, that by it being picked up by the media wrong as world's best whiskey is Lidl's, it actually downplays how very amazing it is that that Lidl bottle won best 12-year-old and under. That's an incredible thing in and of itself, but to then inflate it and then realize what's actually going on maybe downplays how great an award that was. But you touched on a point that's something that I hold absolutely true. I was asked a while back what my thoughts were on proper 12 whiskey, and I could tell that the question was being asked in the way that they wanted to hear me say, oh, it's rubbish, it's going to be bad. I've personally never tried it, but I think it is an absolutely brilliant thing for the industry as a whole. I think anything, like you say, that gets more people to drink brown spirits, to drink whiskey, can only be a good thing. And looking at that from the brand point of view, if one of the 2 million people or whatever the number is that's on Proper 12's Instagram comes to Tomatin eventually, that's a win in and of itself, because that's someone that otherwise maybe would never have been interested in whiskey. So I personally overlooked that argument when looking at that awards thing. So thank you for bringing that up.
And things like that also start to perhaps challenge this idea that whiskey has to be this rarefied and expensive thing. I'm still actually not sure where I sit completely on this one as it concerns Scotch whiskey, because I think there's definitely something to be said for having such a presence in the public mind as a luxury product. I mean, that's probably something that I don't think single malt Scotch whiskey should fritter away in a hurry in its eagerness to chase every single possible sale. But I think brands are being quite sensible and developing spectrums across their ranges, and obviously they're bearing that in mind. But when you do have a little whiskey winning an award, hopefully that means that somebody who wouldn't have gone and spent that £35 or £40 might look at that whiskey on the shelf, see it's at a very reasonable price point, try it. It's actually really good liquid, and that might begin a whole journey for them that's going to lead them to reading blogs and magazines, hopefully, and watching live streams.
Well, it's something that I've always gone back to and said, the first whiskey that I drank that got me interested in whiskey is not necessarily a bottle that I have in the house nowadays. It's all about the stepping stones, and I think that's you tie that back into brands and what they do. It's absolutely the way things work. If you look at the Tomatin range as one little segment of the whiskey industry, even within that range alone, you've got your introduction with Legacy and 12-year-old, and then you might get to the point that you're drinking the 36-year-old, and you probably never drink anything below 18 years old ever again. But it was the Legacy and 12-year-old that got you into it, and that's just one example of a range that then you upscale to the whole industry as a whole, has a lot of stepping stones for a lot of people. And I think that's why, personally, whiskey is the greatest spirits category in the world, is just how much diversity is available.
Exactly. And we're very lucky that it's one of the few categories out there that is just, because of its history and because it was one of these products that effectively, particularly with Scotch, was one of the world's first brands, regardless of anything else. They were in the group of products that began brand marketing. Because of that, they hold this status. It holds this status as an aspirational product at different levels. There's obviously there's different perceptions of different styles of whiskey globally, but particularly with Scotch whiskey, an aspirational single malt purchase or even an aspirational blend purchase doesn't have to be something that's tens of thousands of pounds. It all depends on where people are in their lives and where they are on their whiskey journey and what they want to invest. But we're very lucky to have that.
Think about it. I mean, if you put it in terms of the film industry, you know, that if you're a particular fan of maybe a really niche type of film, black and white silent movies or some French art house cinema, these are all paid for because 100 million people went to see The Expendables 9.
Yeah, exactly.
It's mainstream that pays for the niche, yeah?
Yeah.
So it's things like Proper 12 and Hague Club and Whisky Awards, things in the newspapers. These are all putting money into the industry, which lets us have the things we like.
Yes.
If we see wrong with that.
Yeah, those are the things that allow us to have something to be geeky about.
Sure.
Now, Andy, I'm going to go back to you on this because Tabitha's asked, how do we go about getting non-whiskey drinkers, especially those not stereotypically thought as liking whiskey, to try it? I want to ask you because you started off by telling us that initially you were never really taken by whiskey. So if you're having a conversation with someone and they say that they don't like whiskey, and that whiskey doesn't reach out to them, say, for example, that the marketing of the whiskey brands that you see doesn't appeal to them, how do you get them into whiskey? What's the route to that customer? I think we've got to accept that not everyone is going to like whiskey. I personally think there is a dram for everyone, but they might never find it. So,
yeah, I think, I mean, I've had friends who've said, right, I want, what's a good starter dram? And the first thing to realise is there isn't the same starter dram for everybody, just like there's not a dram for everybody. You know, I've had friends that have started on something really kind of nice and light and have hated it.
Mhm.
And then I've had people who've started on Lefroy 10 and have absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
You know? So it's more about, I think if you're wanting to get someone into whiskey, the idea would be to go to a whiskey bar or get a tasting set and sit down with various different ones and find out which appeals to them most. You know, really try them with a 21 or a, I mean, the cliched answer is to, oh, well, we can try it with a cocktail and we can try and ramp it up with this and that, which might work. But I think the idea is if a chef was coming up with an amazing recipe, he would have an understanding of each of the ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, cocktail-wise, it's great to put whiskey in cocktails. But at the same point, you need to understand what the ingredients are of the cocktail.
Yeah.
If you see where I'm coming with that. So I think some people just enjoy outliers in flavour profiles, you know. So I think that the idea is not to assume there's a starter dram for everybody. But if I knew how to get non-whiskey drinkers into the whiskey drinking category, I'd be making an absolute fortune consulting for a massive whiskey conglomerate right now.
Exactly. And I think going back to Tabitha's point, you know, that's a great way of how to get people into whiskey that actually do have a spark of an interest, because if they're speaking to you about whiskey, the seed is already sown. But going back to Tabitha's point, which is an even bigger question that's been asked by the industry, and like you say, if someone had the answer, they'd be making a lot of money. How do we reach out to people that are maybe not stereotypically targeted by whiskey marketing? And I think, and Chris, I don't know if you agree with this, I think the key to that is collaboration across different categories. And I think, you know, going back to Proper 12 is a great example. I don't think that your traditional MMA fan is necessarily thought of as the sort of person that will be sipping a single malt whiskey at home, but it kind of bridges over those various different interest groups.
I've been watching things like the Metallica whiskey and the Motorhead whiskey and things like that with interest to see what happens there. I mean, what I'm quite pleased to see is that quite a few of these crossover products are actually very good products in and of themselves. They're not just selling themselves off the back of whatever it is. You know, a very early example of this I always think is the Iron Maiden Trooper beer that you see around, and you know that's a really, you know, it just so happens that all of the members of Iron Maiden are really into camera ales. You know, they're really into traditional ales, and they went away and they had their own beer, and it's called the Trooper. And now you see a lot of pubs listing it because it is a nice beer. And I think there's definitely something to be said for that. And best of luck to these brands that are doing these category crossovers. Obviously, there's there's a few other more unusual ones that are perhaps on the horizon for whiskey specifically, particularly partnering with luxury. That it's going to be very interesting to see if that works. It still seems to be relatively untouched soil for the whiskey category. It's the odd crossover's been done, but particularly in terms of engaging with other hyper luxury products, only a couple of categories have really been touched so far. It seems to be very tentative little baby steps, and you can see there's certain market leaders that are maybe moving in, giving it a go, and I'm sure based on their success, we'll be all I don't know, driving Aston Martins and drinking whiskey.
Again, wouldn't that be just fantastic?
I mean, that'd be nice. I keep hoping that maybe they'll be one included in the press pack if we're really lucky.
Well, this time next year, why don't we have another one of these sessions and we can compare our high performance supercars that we've got from the whiskey industry?
Exactly.
I think that's a great place to pick up.
And maybe we can race whoever ends up with the Balvenie Morgan.
Yeah. Yeah, I did see that was going for sale. That'll be an interesting one to see what that goes for.
I think specifically on your point about getting people into whiskey, though, and this is something I should have said earlier. Really, is that whiskey actually kind of has a head start, and this is sort of ties into my idea about this presence in people's minds. When and I know I've talked to Andy about this, and I know he's had similar experiences. Is that when you tell people that you write about whiskey or you work with whiskey, if somebody isn't a whiskey drinker and you're telling them this, quite often, I mean, more often than not, they'll turn around to you and say, "Oh, that's very interesting. I don't drink whiskey, but I'd like to." I mean, what other category in the world do people? I mean, all respect to gin and vodka and rum and things like that, but I don't think that anybody ever says, "Oh, I would really love to drink that thing, vodka one day, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for it yet, or I think I need to learn some more." And it's sort of a mixed blessing and a curse for the whiskey category, really. It has this respect, and people almost feel that they need to graduate through other things before they're allowed to drink whiskey, which is obviously ridiculous, but it's also an interesting position to be in as a category, and not necessarily a bad one.
Yeah, I think there's a fine line between respect and intimidation.
People would like to like it. People want to like it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the important thing.
Yeah, they will try more whiskies in an attempt to find one that they like, whereas they maybe just something that's maybe a trend rather than an aspirational drink. They'll try once and go, "Nah, I don't like that." But they will keep trying with whiskey until they can confidently go to the bar and say, "I'd like X whiskey," and they just feel that they've reached that kind of nice point,
Exactly.
Yeah, it goes back to that age-old adage of whiskey being an acquired taste, doesn't it? It ties into that very well. Now, I said that was my last question, but I've thought of another one, so I'm going to ask it before we go. And that is just a very simple rounding off the evening one. What do you like writing about within whiskey? As a whiskey fan and a history fan, I like reading about the history of distilleries. That's why I found your article on Dalmore fascinating, thoroughly interesting stuff. But is there a part of the whiskey industry in particular that you like researching and writing about?
Do you want to fire on, Andy?
Okay. You know what? Again, going back to the very, very start in your first question, the whole thing about whiskey is I want to know more, but I'm never going to know it all. So I will almost deliberately try, and if there's a blind spot in my knowledge, I will want to learn about that to write about it. So it's almost like a vehicle to enhance my own knowledge. If I'm doing a tasting and I use a certain whiskey, then it's like, right, I'm going to research this distillery, I'm going to research the history. Because I think, as well as people liking flavours, people like facts. People like having little factoids. So they say, right, you like this dram, it's a 15-year-old, whatever, but this happened in the history, or it's using certain casks. They like to have that little fact there. And that's kind of like the way in to spark interest. So that's how I look at whiskey writing. It's almost like, in a way, to my own benefit, to enhance my own knowledge.
Yeah. It's kind of like the pub quiz element of whiskey, the little facts here and there. Yeah. Chris, what about you?
I think I've probably got two answers to that. I mean, I love I love conducting interviews with people. I mean, I'm very nosy, so I like having an excuse to sit down with people and ask them lots of questions that in quite an intense way that that you probably wouldn't get away with in another context. And that's not to say that I put people under pressure, but I very much enjoy that process of when, particularly if you've never met the person, you sit down and you have to work through building up a rapport and getting them to relax, and then deciding how honest they want to be with you, and it's very nice because obviously I feel very privileged because I'm very aware that all of these people, particularly if they're working in industry, they all have guidelines they have to adhere to in terms of their communication strategy and talking points that they know they have to touch on, and being able to get people slowly away from that and really find out what makes them tick, what their passion for whiskey is, and what their unique story is. I think being able to share that with other people is a real privilege, and I hope people I hope readers enjoy it as much as I enjoy writing it up. I guess on the other side of things, the sort of completely, or the more impersonal side of it is I've fallen down a bit of a wood hole, a cask hole in the last few years that got kicked off by a trip to Jerez that I took with Tamdu Distillery. We followed the full sherry cask production process from Galicia. We wandered around the forests and then went to a sawmill, and then went down to the south and saw the full coopering process, seasoning, winemaking, things like that. And that for me sparked all this new set of questions, and I realized that there's only so much information out there at the moment about casks that are used for maturing whiskey. And actually, if you don't have a good knowledge of sherry or wine or rum or actually wood biology, there's only so far you can get with that. And particularly when it comes to the wood itself and the influence of wood and how a wood interacts with alcohol, really you've either got sort of quite basic resources that sometimes are not actually fully accurate or give quite a simplified view of how whiskey interacts with wood during maturation. And then on the other end of the scale, you have academic papers that genuinely require a biochemistry degree to understand. And what I've been trying to do over the last few years is Wikipedia enough chemistry terms to understand these things, and then sort of translate them. So rather than a wood expert, I'm trying to aim to become a wood translator, perhaps, and try and bring some of that information into. I figured if I can understand it enough to be able to convey it in a relatively simple way that doesn't do away with the nuance, then fingers crossed. But that's definitely a real passion for me at the moment.
The cast.
I look forward to reading Maturation for Dummies, which I'm sure
coming soon. Yeah,
gentlemen, thank you so much for your time tonight. That's been a really enjoyable conversation. I look forward to keep reading what both of you write, and I look forward to sharing a real dram with you in the not too distant future, hope. But in the meantime, with an empty glass, Slàinte.
Slàinte.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
No worries, anytime.